Bronn stood in the courtyard of an aging keep on the outskirts of King's Landing. The place smelled of dust and horse sweat, rank with the stale odor of old battles and unwashed men who had passed through over the years. The sun was beginning its long descent toward the horizon, casting an amber glow on the cracked stones beneath his feet. 1,000 thoughts passed through his mind, each weighed against the cold, hard promise of gold. He had always been a sellsword, practical, opportunistic, and not one to let sentiment interfere with good sense. The memories of his long companionship with Tyrion Lannister flickered in his mind like ghosts at the edge of vision. Good times, in their way, and they had been profitable enough. Yet standing there, awaiting the next turn of fate, Bronn found himself wondering where loyalty should end and ambition should begin. At first, he almost laughed when the messenger from Queen Cersei had approached him with a proposition. It was hardly the first time men, and sometimes women, had tried to tempt him away from his alliances. That was the nature of his business. But Cersei was different. She was cunning, she was ruthless, and she knew exactly which strings to pull. She had made sure her offer was not simply about gold. She had dangled a promise of untold riches, yes, but also power and position in a realm whose throne she intended to keep, by any means necessary. Over time, as Bronn stewed on the offer, the promise of a grander life, more security than a mere bag of coins, and an elevated standing among the new order Cersei intended to create began to gnaw at him. He tried to ignore it, but it persisted. It was the quiet nights in a cheap tavern room when he realized how the ephemeral nature of gold could slip through one's fingers if a single bet turned sour. A castle, a title, that was less fleeting. For a man who had risen from near nothing, who had spent his life as a sword for hire, there was a certain gravity to the proposition that was impossible to dismiss. He had learned long ago not to let illusions of brotherhood blind him. Tyrion Lannister was clever, that was certain, and the two of them had forged a bond, though friendship might be too strong a word. They had saved each other's lives on more than one occasion. They had drunk together and shared jokes that no one else in Westeros would find the least bit amusing. Bronn had grown comfortable in Tyrion's service, and Tyrion had come to rely on Bronn's cunning and capacity for violence. But was that enough to stand between Bronn and his future? He found himself idly tracing a crack in the old stone with the tip of his boot, considering the final details of the plan. He had arranged a meeting with Tyrion under the guise of discussing an important matter related to the war effort, a matter too sensitive to be shared in the presence of Daenerys' advisors. Tyrion, who had always been so sure of Bronn's loyalty, had agreed. Now dusk approached, and along with it, the moment when Bronn would have to make his choice. He could almost hear the clink of gold in his head and see the proud lines of a promised castle rising in his mind's eye. He ran a hand over his short beard and wished he were thirsty enough for a drink. But no, he needed his wits about him. Betraying the Queen's hand was no small matter, especially when the Queen's hand happened to be Tyrion Lannister, a man whose cunning was near legendary, who had become an advisor to a dragon queen, and who still possessed the formidable resources of House Lannister. Another man might have hesitated out of fear, but Bronn's heart, if it felt any trepidation, buried it beneath a thick layer of practical self-interest. He moved from the courtyard into the corridor of the keep, boots echoing off the hollow walls. The flickering torches cast dancing shadows that twisted into shapes of beasts along the stone. The old tapestries hanging from rods overhead were too torn to reveal their original subject matter. Bronn knew the place was barely used, which was precisely why he had selected it. An inconspicuous meeting site gave him an advantage in controlling the scene. Outside, through a slit window, the sky turned a shade closer to purple. Dusk would soon slink into full dark. He tried to muster the fragments of whatever loyalty he felt for Tyrion. The memory of that odd camaraderie, built from banter and bloodshed, threatened to sway him. Tyrion had once promised him riches as well, but one was always waiting for those to fully materialize, waiting for wars to be won and dragons to finish their conquest. Cersei's promise had an immediacy to it, a sense of finality. She controlled King's Landing at present, and if she triumphed in the war, the old order would be restored under her iron rule. She was prepared to make deals with men like Bronn, men who understood the game and did not trouble themselves with guilt or illusions of nobility. He paused mid-step. Was he truly prepared to turn on Tyrion for a woman like Cersei Lannister? Then again, Cersei was still Tyrion's sister. It was a twisted game of family, vengeance, and desperate ambitions, and Bronn was no stranger to the underside of human loyalties. Yet the pang of doubt gnawed at him. Once he took this step, there would be no turning back. A guard wearing a plain leather jerkin and carrying a spear passed him with a nod. Bronn ignored the man. He focused on the narrower passageway ahead, heading toward a small receiving room that he had prepared for the meeting. At least 3 loyal men would be in adjacent rooms, ready to spring into action if Tyrion's men tried anything. Not that Tyrion would bring many men. He rarely traveled with a large entourage these days, especially for secretive meetings. With no ceremony or fanfare, Bronn entered the receiving room. It was a cramped space with a single brazier throwing out enough warmth to keep the chill of early evening at bay. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs made up the sum of its furnishings. A single narrow window revealed the last vestiges of daylight, and the night air filtering in was tinged with the smell of the rolling countryside. Bronn took a seat, drew a dagger from his belt, and idly tapped the tip against the surface of the table. The waiting was what unsettled him the most, giving him time to think, giving him time to feel the creeping weight of what was to come. He reminded himself that he had killed for less. But something about this betrayal felt larger than any previous unscrupulous act in his life. Perhaps because it involved Tyrion, who had never truly done him any wrong. In fact, Tyrion had been a better benefactor than most. But gold was gold, and a castle was a castle. And everyone was always quick to remind him that the world was full of traitors. Best to be on the winning side of a betrayal if it must happen. He heard footsteps echo in the corridor, and his spine straightened. A portion of him wanted to stand, but he decided to remain seated. Whoever approached was not alone. The footfalls were too numerous for just Tyrion. That made sense. Tyrion would have come with a handful of guards. Bronn squeezed the dagger hilt, then slid the blade back into its sheath. If Tyrion stepped through the threshold, no doubt he would be anxious, or at least wary. That was how one survived in this world. Bronn forced a neutral expression onto his face, though his stomach churned with the tension of the moment. He scolded himself internally. He was Bronn, after all, not some green boy on his first sale of sword. He had stared down bigger threats than this. But sometimes, personal relationships complicated matters more than any legion of armed men. At last, Tyrion appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 guards wearing the colors of House Targaryen, black and red. Tyrion had a weary look about him. Dark circles lined his eyes, and though he tried to hide it, there was an edge in his gaze that bespoke the sleepless nights of war councils and uneasy truces. He wore simple garb, the attire of a man who had long since dispensed with the opulence once associated with the Lannisters. His expression was guarded, but beneath the caution, there was a flicker of familiarity, of something like relief upon seeing Bronn, perhaps the memory of an old friend. He dismissed his guards with a nod, letting them wait outside the door. Then Tyrion stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The moment the latch clicked, the tension drew tight as a bowstring. Bronn gestured at the chair on the opposite side of the table. "Sit if you want," he said. His voice was casual enough, but the air between them felt charged with years of shared experience and the fresh possibility of betrayal. Tyrion studied the room, his eyes flicking over the small details. The brazier, the table, the single lantern on the wall. "We meet in comfort as always," he said dryly. He approached, took the offered seat, and rested his elbows on the table. His mismatched eyes, one a shade of green, the other flecked with gold, seemed to evaluate every crease in Bronn's face. Bronn gave a short laugh. "Well, it's not exactly the Red Keep, but it'll do. Harder to eavesdrop in a place that no one cares about." Tyrion nodded. "I suppose that's why you chose it. So, what pressing matter do you have that demanded I slip away from the eyes of a dragon queen?" For a moment, Bronn almost felt the impulse to warn Tyrion, to give him a chance to walk away, to keep some measure of the bond they once shared. But he remembered Cersei's message, the gold, the promise of a title, the intangible weight of her menacing threat if he failed. "You could say it's about your family," he answered. "Your dear sister, to be exact." Tyrion's jaw tightened. Yes, Cersei is always a pressing matter, though not usually the sort you'd want to discuss privately. "She hasn't sent an assassin after me again, has she?" Bronn smirked but said nothing for a moment. The silence stretched. Tyrion's stare grew more intense. "Go on," the Lannister urged. Bronn leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "I'm not a man for riddles. We've done business in the past without them. But something's changed, Tyrion." Tyrion exhaled, a hint of impatience swirling with unease. "You're scowling like a man who's stepped in horse dung. If there's something on your mind, best spit it out." "Your sister has a proposition," Bronn said, letting the words hang in the air. "For me?" Tyrion's face did not contort in surprise, but his eyes flicked with a spark of wariness. He sat back in the chair and folded his hands in his lap. "She's offered you gold," he surmised. "Perhaps a castle, too?" Bronn's lips curled in a half-smile. "Am I that predictable?" "It's not you who's predictable. It's Cersei," Tyrion said. His tone weighed with resignation. "She's always known how to buy men, and she would think she can buy you away from me. And can she?" In the hush that followed, the crackling of the brazier sounded remarkably loud. Tyrion cast a quick glance at the door, as though to reassure himself that his guards stood ready on the other side. "You and I have had an understanding. I paid you well, or tried to, when you stood by me. I even promised you a castle once, if you recall." Bronn let out a short bark of laughter. "Promised, yes, but promises are as easy to break as they are to make. You might sit at the queen's side, but the queen you serve isn't quite as free with her rewards as your sister. Daenerys Targaryen might be a noble sort, but nobility rarely buys a man like me what I truly want." Tyrion pressed his lips together. "Perhaps not, but you must consider the long term. Cersei's offers are coated in honey, but there's always poison beneath. You know this as well as I do." Bronn shrugged. "Poisons, alliances, betrayals. We're living in uncertain times. People turn on each other in the blink of an eye." Tyrion's gaze hardened. "Tell me what she's offered you. Is it something I can match?" Bronn studied the man, seeing the desperation Tyrion tried to hide. Perhaps the desperation was not so much for himself, but for a realm that Tyrion still, in his own twisted way, hoped to see at peace. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe Tyrion did not want to lose the one companion who had stayed by his side through so much. "A lordship," Bronn answered plainly. "A keep, a seat, gold enough for generations. And not just a pinch of gold. She's promised that if she wins this war, I'd be well-placed in the new order. Beyond the scrapes I've had to endure at your side." Tyrion's breathing sounded faintly ragged in the quiet room. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "And do you believe her? She's reneged on deals with men who had more powerful names than Bronn. She's plotted the downfall of lords and ladies who once swore fealty to her. Her word is worth less than the air used to speak it." Bronn's eyes flickered with amusement. "Oh, I know who I'm dealing with, but I also know who else she's dealing with. There's a chance she'll come out on top, and if she does, I'd rather be counted among her allies than rotting in a ditch somewhere." Tyrion sighed, his expression momentarily wavering. Then he brought a forced calm to his features. "So, you want me to sweeten the pot? Is that it? More gold. A better keep. Something to ensure your loyalty remains." Bronn stayed silent for a moment. He felt an uncomfortable twist in his chest, as if two parts of himself were warring. One wanting to bargain with Tyrion and keep the old arrangement, the other wanting to seize the bigger chance for advancement that Cersei dangled before him. He could take more time, way more options, but Cersei wanted action, and soon. Her instructions had been clear. Deliver Tyrion to her, dead or alive, or else do something that might cripple Daenerys' war effort. It was not as if Bronn hadn't mulled over alternate plans, like pretending to betray Tyrion but feeding him information about Cersei. He might have toyed with playing both sides, but such a game was fraught with danger, and Cersei's eyes were everywhere. One false move would see him on the wrong side of a crossbow bolt. He reached across the table with deliberate calm, opening his palm in a conciliatory gesture. Tyrion, we've both had each other's backs, and it hasn't all been bad. But times change. People change. I'm a practical man. Tyrion stared at Bronn's hand, though he did not take it. I've always known that about you. Bronn nodded slowly. Then you know I have to do what's best for me. If I can't be sure you can give me the life I want, I have to consider other options. A moment passed, silent but for the crackle of the brazier. Tyrion's face fell, as though he understood in that instant that there would be no more bargaining, no more clever ploys. So you've made your decision. Bronn gave a faint, almost apologetic shrug. A man's got to eat. A man's got to survive. And if he can do better than survive, if he can thrive, why not? Tyrion closed his eyes, exhaled, and nodded. He didn't rise from the chair. I always thought you'd be the one man who might stick around longer. Despite our differences, At that moment, the heavy footsteps of several men sounded outside. Tyrion turned, alarm flickering in his eyes, but it was too late. The door burst open, and 3 armed men rushed inside. They wore no insignia, sellswords hired by Cersei or her agents, or men loyal to Bronn personally. Tyrion leapt to his feet, but one guard seized him by the arm. The other 2 guards aimed crossbows at him. Tyrion glared at Bronn, betrayal flashing across his features. You're handing me over? Bronn stood up, slowly, as if the entire motion caused him physical pain. Cersei gave me terms. I either deliver you or ensure you won't be a thorn in her side. She's quite insistent these days. Tyrion's voice simmered with anger. We could have worked this out. I might have matched whatever she promised. She's also threatened me if I don't do as she says. Bronn cut in. Not to mention, if she wins this war and finds out I let you slip away, I'll be a marked man. You know her well enough to realize she'd keep that promise. Your side of the war isn't exactly guaranteed to win. One of the guards twisted Tyrion's arm until he hissed in pain, forcing him back into the chair. Bronn raised a hand, silently telling the men not to be overly rough. He didn't hate Tyrion, after all, but the logic was unassailable. Cersei had cornered him. Even if Daenerys won, Bronn had a feeling that other powers would rearrange themselves, and he'd never gain the seat he wanted. If Cersei prevailed, however, the reward might be exactly as he'd always dreamed. His own keep, his own piece of security in a brutal realm. Tyrion looked up at Bronn, his face a twisted mask of contempt and sorrow. I believed you might stand by me, he said quietly. I thought our arrangement was stronger than this. Bronn could only exhale a laugh devoid of humor. Me too for a while, but I learned a long time ago not to fight destiny. You're a Lannister, Tyrion, but Cersei, she's the kind of Lannister who gets what she wants. Tyrion winced as one of the guards bound his wrists. She may kill me anyway. She might, Bronn acknowledged, but that's not my concern, once you're in her hands. My part is simply making the delivery. Outside, the shadows had deepened, and the night sky spread over the keep. Tyrion was dragged to his feet and marched out of the room, the guards flanking him on either side. Bronn followed behind, ignoring the pang in his gut. It was the twinge of guilt, the lingering echo of shared battles and jokes that no one else understood, the memory of a shorter, more vulnerable man who had once paid Bronn's way to a better life. He forced himself not to dwell on it. There was no undoing what had been set into motion. They stepped into the courtyard, where a wagon waited with an enclosed prison cage, discreetly covered with a canvas tarp. The keep was mostly deserted. Cersei had chosen it well, ensuring it wouldn't draw suspicion. Tyrion's guards, though outnumbered, tried to intervene, but Bronn's men swiftly dealt with them, knocking them unconscious or binding them. Tyrion watched with a mix of fury and resignation. As the men began locking Tyrion inside the wagon, he turned his head to Bronn and said, voice low, "You'll regret this." Bronn met his gaze only for a second, then turned away to help the guards secure the wagon's latch. "Maybe," he allowed, But not if your sister holds up her end of the deal. Once everything was set, Bronn ordered the men to move out. The small convoy of hired sellswords led the wagon down a winding path away from the keep. Torches bobbed in the hands of the men at the front. In the distance, the lights of King's Landing glimmered like distant, watchful eyes. Bronn wondered if Daenerys or anyone else of Tyrion's allies would notice his disappearance in time to intercept. It was possible, but he had set up this operation carefully. He had men ready to divert any search parties and to slip past the usual patrolled roads. The city's gates might be more challenging, but a bribe here or there, plus using the lesser-known entrances, would go a long way. A sigil ring that one of... He rode on horseback beside the wagon, occasionally casting a glance at the shape of Tyrion beneath the canvas. Tyrion was silent now, probably stewing in anger or trying to think his way out of the predicament. Bronn almost wanted to talk to him, to offer some twisted form of apology, but it would do neither of them any good. Better to focus on the road ahead. The ride was long, though, and through the winding countryside, doubt started creeping up on him once more. He pushed it down. He reminded himself that he wasn't a hero. He had never claimed to be. Everything he had done for Tyrion, fighting in the Ares sky cells, risking life and limb at the Battle of Blackwater, had been for payment or at least the promise of it. He had grown to like Tyrion, but liking someone did not necessarily translate into throwing away one's future. He had to keep telling himself this, as if it were a mantra that might quell the sense of unease clawing at him. Dawn was approaching by the time they reached the outskirts of King's Landing. The amber glow stretched across the sky, revealing the high walls and distant towers. The sea breeze, faint and salty, touched Bronn's face. The road leading to the capital was quiet in the early morning. Even the usual throng of traders and peasants had not begun their daily bustle. Good, he thought. Less chance of someone recognizing Tyrion's men or stumbling upon this little caravan. They turned onto a dirt path that circumvented the main gate. There was an old postern gate that had seen less official use since the early days of the Mad King. Bronn had already arranged for a pair of unscrupulous guards loyal to Qyburn, or perhaps loyal only to coin, to let them in. Sure enough, at the gate, they were met by a pair of men in Lannister uniforms who raised lanterns to inspect the wagon. They peeked under the canvas, saw Tyrion, then stepped back with startled looks. One spat at the ground, apparently harboring some personal grudge against the dwarf he considered a traitor. The other guard merely grunted, then waved them through. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage that snaked between the outer wall and the city's internal structures. Once they had passed into the gloom of the postern corridor, one guard slammed the gate shut. The clank of iron was enough to make Bronn's heart skip a beat. He was now on Cersei's turf, with her guards at every corner. If this went badly, he could end up pinned and helpless. He resisted the urge to grip his sword hilt too tightly, forcing himself to maintain outward composure. They navigated a labyrinth of alleyways, avoiding the main streets as the city slowly awakened. The stench of King's Landing, rot, sewage, and sweat, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the crisp countryside they had just left. Workers and merchants began to populate the streets, but the wagons stuck to shadowy lanes. The sellswords guided the horses carefully, mindful of each turn. This was all part of the plan to reach the Red Keep unnoticed, or at least without drawing too much attention. When they finally emerged near a lesser-known entrance to the keep's sprawling grounds, the men stopped at a heavily guarded gate. Lannister bannermen stationed there recognized the sigil ring that one of Bronn's men held up as a token from Qyburn. The guards opened the gate, and with that, Bronn and his men made their way into a hidden courtyard used for discreet deliveries and comings, and goings that the crown did not wish to publicize. No sooner had the wagon wheels come to a halt on the worn cobblestones than a cluster of red-cloaked guards approached, led by one of Cersei's knights, a tall, hawk-faced man with a haughty bearing. He gestured brusquely, and the sellswords began unloading Tyrion from the wagon. Bronn dismounted and walked over, ignoring the suspicious looks the redcloaks cast in his direction. Tyrion, now unshackled from the wagon but still bound hand and foot, was dragged onto the courtyard stones. Tyrion stood unsteadily, his face grim, the corners of his mouth pressed into a tight line. His clothes were dusty from the journey, and there was a hint of blood on his lower lip where he might have bitten it in frustration or been struck by a guard. The hawk-faced knight examined Tyrion with open contempt, then turned his gaze to Bronn. "The queen waits for him in the dungeons," the knight said, his voice echoing in the enclosed courtyard. "You'll come with us." Bronn noted how it wasn't a request but a statement of fact. He gave a curt nod. He glanced at Tyrion, whose eyes flicked with an unspoken mixture of anger and despair. Bronn did not speak. What was there to say? They led Tyrion through a side entrance into the Red Keep, winding down spiraling staircases that led to torchlit corridors. The air grew colder and damper as they descended. The stone walls were thick with moss in places, and the silence was broken only by the jingle of chains and the echo of boots. Tyrion stumbled once, but no one offered him assistance. Bronn walked behind the cluster of guards, silent, stoic. He felt an unsettling tightness in his chest as they neared the dungeons. He had been there before, on many errands in service to Tyrion or others, but never under these circumstances. At last, they came to a broad corridor, flanked by cells with iron bars. Torches on the walls cast flickering shadows. Standing at the far end, near a heavier iron door that presumably led to a more secure cell, was Queen Cersei Lannister herself. She wore a dark gown embroidered with gold, her hair styled short, her posture rigid. Behind her stood Qyburn, wearing his usual expression of polite malevolence, and Ser Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, loomed like a statue of death, helmet obscuring his face. The guards halted several paces from the queen and forced Tyrion to his knees. One guard shoved his face down until his forehead nearly touched the cold stone floor. Cersei stepped forward, her eyes bright with malicious satisfaction. For a long moment, she simply stared at Tyrion, who glowered back at her. Then she looked at Bronn. "So you've kept your word," she said, voice smooth as silk. "I wasn't entirely certain you'd find the spine to deliver him to me." She let her gaze roam over the sellswords who had accompanied Bronn, taking in the scene with a critical eye. "Did he give you any trouble?" Bronn shrugged. "He was always a talker, but no real trouble. He came with a couple of guards, but we took care of them." Cersei cast a faint smile. "Good. I had hoped you'd see reason." She flicked her gaze to Tyrion, who knelt at her feet. "He will be confined in a special cell until I decide his fate." Then her eyes returned to Bronn. "We will discuss your reward, Ser Bronn. A fitting reward for loyalty." Tyrion stirred, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Loyalty," he spat, though the word was muffled by his position. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Cersei's lips pulled into a sneer. "You should be grateful to be alive, dear brother. Had I gotten my way sooner, your head would have adorned a spike above the city gates. But perhaps there's more enjoyment to be had in making you watch as your beloved Dragon Queen's cause collapses." Her tone was almost playful in its cruelty. Qyburn stepped forward, clearing his throat with exaggerated delicacy. "Your Grace, we should move him into the deeper cells. He'll be guarded at all times, naturally. And you might wish to extract information from him about Daenerys Targaryen's troop movements, her supply lines." Cersei raised a hand, silencing her master of whispers. "Indeed, that can wait a moment." She leveled her eyes at Bronn once more. "Follow me." She turned sharply, her gown sweeping across the floor, and walked into a small side chamber adjoining the corridor. The chamber was dimly lit by a single brazier, not unlike the one Bronn had used at the keep outside the city. She waited for Bronn to enter and signaled for Ser Gregor to stand guard outside, presumably to keep prying ears away. Qyburn hovered in the doorway like a pale wraith, but Cersei waved him off with a slight motion of her hand. As the door closed, Cersei considered Bronn with a calculating gaze. "You've done well," she said softly. "I admit, I didn't fully trust you." Bronn forced a grin he hoped did not reveal the knots in his stomach. "I'm a man of my word, Your Grace, when the deal is right." Cersei arched an eyebrow. Yes, well, we shall see if the deal remains right. If you prove yourself useful, you'll be well rewarded. Perhaps more so than you imagined. Her eyes glinted in the low firelight. I want to know everything my brother said to you. Did he suspect anything? Bronn shook his head. He thought I was calling him out for some secret war talk. He might have had a suspicion that something was off. But no, I don't think he believed I'd truly hand him over. Cersei's lips twitched in something like amusement. He always had a soft spot for you. More fool him. And now I have him exactly where I want him. Bronn nodded, though a part of him felt a twinge of unease at the coldness in her voice. So, about my reward? He ventured, keeping his tone respectful. Cersei circled him slowly, as though examining a piece of property. You shall have it, of course. But first, understand that I do not dispense gifts without expecting continued service. If you think you can simply take a castle and ride off into the sunset, you are gravely mistaken. Consider this the beginning of a new arrangement between us. Bronn forced himself to meet her gaze. I'm ready to serve, Your Grace, as long as it's worth my while. Cersei's smile was thin. It will be. You will have a lordship. There is a keep near the Reach that's fallen vacant after its lord foolishly pledged to Daenerys and died in a skirmish. We need strong men to hold these lands, and you will do so in my name. Once this war is won, you'll have your place. Bronn felt a spark of excitement flicker, though he kept his expression neutral. The prospect of land in the Reach, fertile, rich farmland, was better than some worthless castle in the mountains. If Cersei delivered on her promise, that alone could set him up for life. But he knew better than to fully trust her. Consider me at your disposal, he said, bowing his head slightly. Cersei let out a quiet laugh, though there was no mirth in it. Good. Now let us return to the matter of my dear brother. They emerged from the chamber, and in the corridor, Tyrion was already being dragged toward the deeper dungeons. He kept his composure, though every step must have been humiliating. Cersei signaled to the guards to halt. She cast a cold look at Tyrion. Before you lock him away, she commanded, make sure he is comfortable enough to speak. I have questions I want answered. In time, I may let him see the light again, or I may not. Tyrion said nothing, but his eyes burned with defiance. Cersei turned to Bronn. You should witness this, Ser Bronn, since you brought him to me. Bronn remained silent. He followed as they proceeded deeper into the dungeon, passing empty cells that reeked of mildew and old urine. At the end of a damp passage, they opened a heavy door reinforced with iron bars. Inside was a small cell lit by a single torch bracketed to the wall. The guards shoved Tyrion in. He stumbled, nearly crashing into the stone wall. Then the door slammed shut, the clang of metal reverberating through the corridor. Bronn stood to one side, arms folded, face impassive. He tried not to let the memory of the better times with Tyrion weigh on him too heavily. This was the life he had chosen. Cersei peered through the bars, her gaze cool. You've caused me endless grief, Tyrion, she said. But now, at long last, you're where you belong. Tyrion leaned back against the wall, breathing heavily. And you've caused the realm endless grief, Cersei, he retorted, though his voice was weakened by the rough journey. But your time will come to an end, as all tyrants' times do. Cersei simply watched him for a moment, her lips curling into an icy smile. She flicked her gaze to the guards. Watch him closely. Let no one in without my explicit permission. Should any attempt be made to free him, alert me at once. The guards bowed their heads. With that, Cersei pivoted on her heel and swept down the corridor, her retinue following. Bronn spared one last glance through the bars at Tyrion, whose expression was a mix of anger and something else, maybe regret. Bronn offered no words, no explanation, before turning to follow the queen. Tyrion's glare followed him as he disappeared into the gloom. The day passed in a blur for Bronn. He found himself summoned to Qyburn's laboratory, where the pallid man asked him pointed questions about Tyrion's recent activities, Daenerys' strategies, and the layout of her forces. Bronn shared what he knew, though it was less extensive than Qyburn might have hoped. He had not been privy to all of Tyrion's conversations with the Dragon Queen. Eventually, Qyburn waved him away like a dismissible servant. Before leaving, Bronn caught a glimpse of the man's twisted experiments. Jars filled with odd substances, skeletons of small animals, and instruments that looked more suited to torture than healing. He exited quickly, unsettled by the hush and the smell of chemicals in that dreadful chamber. By evening, Bronn was shown to a comfortable suite in the Red Keep's guest quarters. It was modest compared to what High Lords might enjoy, but far better than the hovel he had inhabited when he was only a sellsword in King's Landing. A table laden with food and wine greeted him, courtesy, he presumed, of Queen Cersei. The faint perfume of roast duck and honeyed carrots reminded him just how hungry he was. He ate heartily, washing down mouthfuls with strong wine, trying to blot out the memory of Tyrion locked in a cell just a few floors below. He told himself this was the price of a better life, that Tyrion would have done the same if their positions were reversed. Yet he knew in his heart that Tyrion had proven more loyal than that. Tyrion had risked his own life for Bronn on more than one occasion. Night fell over King's Landing, and Bronn found himself staring out a narrow window at the city lights. The wind was mild, the sky cloudy. Tomorrow, Cersei had hinted she would speak again of his new holdings in the Reach, finalize the details. All he had to do was remain her dog a while longer. But something gnawed at him, a feeling that the victory might be hollow, that any reward from Cersei came with strings too tangled to escape. He wondered if, in the weeks to come, he would find himself half wishing for simpler times, traveling the roads with Tyrion, fighting side by side, the banter between them a shield against the ugliness of the world. The next day dawned, and Bronn awoke early. True to her word, Cersei summoned him to the throne room after her morning court session. The air in the hall was thick with tension. The Iron Throne loomed on its dais, the entire room dominated by dark columns and stained glass windows. The gold cloaks flanked the entrance, and a smattering of courtiers and minor lords stood around, eager to watch the queen dispense her twisted idea of justice. Bronn strode across the stone floor, head held high, his black leathers polished. He tried to ignore the sneers and whispers from the courtiers. Some recognized him, no doubt, as the rogue sellsword who had once aligned himself with Tyrion. Others saw him as a turncoat, but they would never voice such words aloud in Cersei's presence. Cersei was seated on the Iron Throne, her posture regal, clad in a gown of deep crimson with gold accents. The small crown she wore glittered in the torchlight. She beckoned Bronn closer with a languid gesture. At her side stood Qyburn, hands folded in his robes, looking half bored, half amused. Ser Gregor stood behind the throne like a gargoyle given flesh. "Ser Bronn," Cersei began, "step forward." He obeyed, halting at the base of the dais steps. He remembered standing in this same throne room years ago, when Joffrey was king, how the air had crackled with hostility then too. Some things never changed. Cersei's voice rang out in the near-silent hall. "Yesterday, you proved your loyalty by delivering to me the traitor and kinslayer Tyrion Lannister. For that, you shall be rewarded. Rise and stand before your queen." Bronn did so, stepping up the first step of the dais. Cersei cast a sidelong glance at Qyburn, who stepped forward and began to read from a scroll in his reedy voice. "By command of Queen Cersei Lannister, defender of the realm, protector of the Iron Throne, the man known as Ser Bronn of the Blackwater shall receive a lordship. He shall be granted command and stewardship of Crow's Nest Keep in the southwestern region of the Reach, along with all attendant lands and incomes. From this day forth, he shall be styled Lord Bronn of Crow's Nest, a vassal of the crown." The words echoed across the throne room. A startled murmur rose from the courtiers. The name of the keep, Crow's Nest, was not widely known, but it was rumored to be a profitable holding. Bronn felt a rush, something like pride, but tempered by the knowledge that he stood on precarious ground. He had gotten what he wanted, or at least the beginnings of it. He bowed low. "Thank you, Your Grace." Cersei nodded, a satisfied glint in her eyes. "Your tasks are not yet complete, Lord Bronn. Once I have consolidated my hold on the realm, I expect you to take command of your new lands and ensure they remain loyal. For now, I have use of you here in King's Landing." Bronn inclined his head. "As you wish." Cersei leaned back on the Iron Throne. "You will lead a small group of men to intercept any communications between my brother's allies. They will attempt to free him, no doubt. You must see that they fail." It was a new order, another rung in Cersei's game of control. Bronn suspected that Daenerys Targaryen, or perhaps Jaime Lannister, if he still had any feelings left for Tyrion, would indeed attempt a rescue. "I'll do what needs to be done," he replied. Cersei offered a tight smile. "Good. Now go and see the steward, who will formalize the transfer of these lands. Then return to me for additional orders." She waved him away, turning her attention to a trembling petitioner who had been waiting for an audience. Bronn stepped away, feeling the weight of eyes upon him. He left the throne room and found a steward in the antechamber who handed him official documents bearing the royal seal. He scanned the parchment, letting the words wash over him, words that proclaimed him Lord Bronn of Crow's Nest. It felt surreal but also precarious. He had never trusted too heavily in titles or parchment. Still, it was the outward symbol of his new station. That afternoon, Cersei had him accompany a squad of gold cloaks to the city gates to watch for any sign of infiltration. The day dragged on, hot and stifling, and Bronn's mind wandered to Tyrion locked in the depths of the Red Keep. He might be undergoing questioning even now, or languishing in isolation. Cersei would not kill him outright if she believed she could extract intelligence. But she might stage a public execution if Daenerys advanced on the city, using Tyrion's life as a bargaining chip. The politics were messy, and Bronn found himself half wishing he could fade away to his promised keep. But Cersei's hold on him was strong. She would not let him go until the war's outcome was decided. And if Daenerys' forces did arrive, Bronn would be caught. As dusk approached, Bronn returned to the keep. The air crackled with the possibility of conflict. Rumors of Daenerys' unsullied and Dothraki forces moving closer to King's Landing had begun to spread. Some said the dragons were on the wing, though others claimed the dragons had been wounded in some previous battle. Bronn could not know the truth, but he knew enough to sense that the city stood on the precipice of a storm. And in the middle of that storm was Tyrion, Cersei's captive, and the knowledge he might hold about Daenerys' plans. Bronn found himself drawn to the dungeons that evening. Officially, he had the authority to check on the prisoner for security reasons. Unofficially, a lingering part of him wanted to reassure himself that Tyrion was still alive, that he hadn't contributed to his immediate demise. 2 gold cloaks stood outside the heavy door leading to Tyrion's cell. They recognized Bronn, and after a hesitant glance, they let him through, presumably under the assumption that he was here on Cersei's orders. The stench of damp stone and unwashed humanity greeted him as he stepped inside. Tyrion sat on a small bench, shackled to the wall by a length of chain. The torchlight cast stark shadows on his face, making his features appear gaunt. He looked up when Bronn entered. There was a moment of silence before Tyrion spoke, his voice rasping from disuse. "Come to gloat, Lord Bronn of Crow's Nest?" he asked, sarcasm dripping from his tone. Bronn closed the door behind him, leaning against it. "I'm no lord to you, Tyrion. Just a man doing what he must." Tyrion gave a hollow laugh. "I see. Is that how you console yourself at night?" He tugged at his chains, though it accomplished nothing. "I suppose I can't entirely fault you. This realm is built on betrayals. And you, after all, are but a cell's word." Bronn let out a slow breath. "Believe it or not, I didn't want it to go this way. Didn't you?" Tyrion shot back. "You wanted a castle. I promised you one. But that wasn't enough, was it?" Bronn pursed his lips. "I never saw that castle. Your queen, Daenerys, never did hand it over. And even if she had, I'm not sure it would be enough. All I heard from you was soon and after the war. Meanwhile, your sister had something more immediate to offer, and a threat to match." Tyrion shrugged, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "Yes, Cersei does have a knack for quick solutions. But I wonder if you've actually gained anything, or merely postponed your death until she decides your usefulness has run its course. Bronn folded his arms. He glanced at the empty corridor behind him, ensuring they were truly alone. Look, I know what she's like, but I have a chance to secure something permanent for myself. And we both know you can't guarantee your side will win, or that Daenerys won't burn down half the city with her dragons. You're not wrong, Tyrion said softly. Then he locked eyes with Bronn. But do you really think you'll escape the fallout if that happens? Bronn didn't answer. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. What does she do to you? Has she questioned you? Tyrion laughed mirthlessly. What do you think? Qyburn's come by to ask about Daenerys' troop movements, about potential weak points. I've told him very little, not because I'm noble, but because I genuinely don't know many of the tactical details. Daenerys keeps her own counsel. I'm just her advisor. Ex-advisor, perhaps. Bronn exhaled. Well, as long as you're alive, that's something. He looked around the cell, noting the bucket in the corner and a small pitcher of water. I can bring you a bit more food, maybe. Quietly. Tyrion's eyebrows rose. Ah, now the traitor grows a conscience. How charming. If you're trying to assuage guilt, you're wasting your breath. Unless you have the means to slip me out of here, I'd rather you not bother pretending we're friends. Bronn's temper flared. I'm not here to indulge your self-pity, Lannister. Tyrion stood, the chain rattling at his wrist. Then why are you here? To assure yourself that I'm properly miserable, or to test if I have any secrets to divulge that you can trade for more favor with Cersei? Bronn clenched his jaw. He didn't fully know why he'd come. Some mixture of regret and curiosity. Perhaps. The realization of his own confusion made him more irritable. I just wanted to see if you were breathing. Now I have my answer. He turned to go. Tyrion's voice halted him at the door. Bronn, the tide will turn. If you've learned anything from me, learn this. Cersei may promise you the world, but she always demands more in return than you ever bargained for. Bronn looked over his shoulder. I know what I'm dealing with. Tyrion's laugh was sharp. No, I don't think you do. Bronn paused, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Then he pushed the door open and left, not wanting to hear more of Tyrion's warnings. He had already weighed them all in his mind. The corridor outside seemed darker than before, and the stench more pungent. He gave the guards a terse nod and climbed the steps back to the upper levels of the keep. The following days were tense. Queen Cersei deployed her men in strategic positions around King's Landing, fortifying the walls, stationing archers and scorpions that could be aimed at dragons if they appeared. Rumors drifted in about Daenerys' approach. Some said she had only one dragon left, others claimed two. Whichever the truth, every soldier in the city was on edge. Bronn found himself assigned to a squad that patrolled near the dragon pit, ensuring no infiltration occurred from that direction. Occasionally, Bronn would catch glimpses of Jaime Lannister, once Cersei's closest confidant, now a haunted figure lurking in the keep's halls. Jaime had left the city after breaking with Cersei, or so the rumors went, but apparently had returned under uncertain circumstances. Some said he was trying to reason with Cersei, others that he was forcibly detained. Bronn tried to steer clear of Jaime, not wishing to stir that particular hornet's nest. Jaime might ask about Tyrion, or might resent Bronn's betrayal. Best to keep a low profile, focusing on the tasks assigned by Cersei and quietly longing for the day he could claim his keep in the Reach. Then, one morning, a tense hush fell over the entire castle. The watchers on the city walls reported a column of soldiers in Targaryen black approaching from the west, accompanied by a single dragon circling overhead. The city's bells remained silent, but the tension was palpable. Cersei gathered her council, including Qyburn and a handful of trusted knights. She summoned Bronn too, ordering him to remain at her side as the city prepared for a possible siege. Bronn's mouth felt dry as he stood on a balcony overlooking the main gate. In the distance, he could make out the small shapes of soldiers in tight formation, and above them a great winged shape, a dragon though smaller than he remembered. Perhaps it was wounded, or perhaps his memory had inflated the creature's size. Either way, it was still a dragon. If Daenerys decided to unleash it upon King's Landing, no scorpion or ballista might stop it in time. The city had become a tinderbox, waiting for a single spark. Yet Daenerys did not attack immediately. A raven arrived from her camp, bearing a message for Cersei. Bronn did not learn the contents of that message, but he deduced that some sort of negotiation or parley was at play. He heard talk that Daenerys demanded the release of Tyrion Lannister, offering a truce or at least a cessation of hostilities in exchange. Some courtiers whispered that Daenerys would never truly uphold such a bargain. She wanted the throne, not a truce. Cersei, of course, had no intention of releasing Tyrion. However, she played along, at least publicly. She ordered a war council that night, summoning her commanders to discuss how best to respond. Bronn attended, standing near the back of the chamber, listening as the lords bickered over whether to open the gates for a parley or to fortify and force Daenerys into a siege. Cersei wanted to lure Daenerys into a vulnerable position, possibly within range of the Scorpions, or ambush her men if they tried to enter the city under a flag of truce. Bronn's gaze flicked across the room. He saw Jaime standing near the Queen, silent, stoic, his expression unreadable. He recalled rumors of Jaime's earlier desertion. Had he truly come back to support Cersei's fight, or was something else at play? Bronn had always liked Jaime in a grudging sort of way. The man had a certain honor lurking beneath his Lannister arrogance. But those days felt far away now. At the end of the meeting, Cersei approached Bronn directly, ignoring the wary looks from the lords around her. "Ser Bronn, Lord Bronn," she corrected herself with a small smirk. "I have a new task for you. If Daenerys attempts to negotiate, I want you to be there, hidden among the archers. If I give the signal, you and your archers will cut her down." "Understood." Bronn's stomach twisted. Killing Daenerys Targaryen would be no small thing, especially if she had a dragon at her side. But disobeying Cersei now would risk his newly minted lordship and his life. He forced a nod. "Understood, Your Grace." Cersei's eyes gleamed with cruelty. "Excellent. I do so like it when my men prove their worth. Now go make the arrangements. Be ready at dawn." Bronn bowed and departed, the weight of the order pressing on him. He had once fought against Daenerys's dragon in the field, nearly losing his life. He remembered the terror of Drogon's fiery breath searing the battlefield. Now he might have to face that threat again. But he tried to calm himself. Perhaps negotiations would fail, and Daenerys would retreat to regroup. Or perhaps she would come unguarded enough that the Scorpions could do their work. Either way, he had little choice. Later that night, as Bronn moved through the keep, preparing the men and ensuring the Scorpions on the walls were ready, he passed by the entrance to the dungeons. A whisper of curiosity rose in him again. Tyrion was down there. Did he know what was happening? Possibly. Qyburn might have tried to wring more information from him. If Daenerys was indeed close, Tyrion might guess some kind of confrontation was imminent. Part of Bronn wanted to warn him, but what good would that do? Tyrion was chained in a cell. No rescue was likely to come for him in time. As Bronn approached the open door to the stairwell leading down, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Jaime Lannister, still clad in his familiar gold armor, though the shine was tarnished, his face drawn. He met Bronn's eyes, expression guarded. "I was wondering if I might find you here," Jaime said quietly. Bronn tensed. "I'm on my way to see to some business for the Queen." Jaime glanced at the staircase. "Going to see Tyrion, or just passing by?" Bronn decided to be honest. There was no point in lying. "Passing by. But maybe I was thinking about it." Jaime studied him. "I've heard you're the one who delivered Tyrion to Cersei." Bronn shrugged, though he felt uneasy. "A job's a job, Jaime. I'm a sell's word. You know that." Jaime's jaw tightened. "Yes, I suppose I do. But Tyrion, you were his friend, as much as he had any." Bronn bit back a retort that he was never truly anyone's friend. But it sounded hollow even in his own head. "He paid me well enough until he didn't. Your sister offered better." Jaime closed his eyes for a moment, as though pained. "Does it ever trouble you, the choices you make? Or is gold truly enough to silence the conscience?" Bronn felt anger stirring. Don't talk to me about conscience, Kingslayer. We've all done things. Jaime's expression flickered with guilt and frustration, but he forced a measure of calm. I'm not here to fight you. He paused, looking off down the corridor. The Queen plans something terrible at dawn, doesn't she? Bronn hesitated. She wants me to position archers. If Daenerys comes for a parley, we're to take the shot if given a signal. Jaime lowered his gaze. So we resort to treachery now. Cersei's no fool. She'll do anything to hold on to power. And she'll kill Tyrion in the end. The words hung between them. Bronn felt a pang, recalling Tyrion's desperate warning that Cersei would eventually turn on him. Jaime's expression was grim. I suppose she's promised you some lands, a title if you do your part? Bronn nodded. Yes, Crow's Nest in the Reach. Jaime exhaled. And do you trust her to uphold that promise? Bronn scoffed quietly. Not entirely, no. But I know better than to cross her now. Jaime shook his head slowly. You always wanted your damned castle. Now you might get it if Cersei wins. But if Daenerys prevails, or if the city goes up in flames, what then? Bronn shrugged, masking his own uncertainty. I'll worry about that if it happens. I'm not blind to the risk, but I've chosen my side. There's no going back. Jaime studied him a moment. I don't suppose you'd do one last favor for Tyrion? Bronn fixed him with a measured look. You're asking me to free him? Jaime nodded, though he looked pained as he did so. Yes, if Daenerys loses or if the city falls, Tyrion will be killed. He's my brother. I don't expect you to care, but I'll do what I can to ensure you aren't left in a bad position afterward. If you could just let him go quietly. I'll find a way to smuggle him out of the city. Bronn felt torn. Such a move would be suicidal if Cersei found out, and she would find out eventually. Jaime, I appreciate that you care about Tyrion, but if I do that, I might as well put a knife to my own throat. Cersei doesn't forgive traitors. Jaime's voice was low, urgent. She's going to lose this war. Daenerys' forces may be battered, but they still have a dragon, and the armies in the north aren't as broken as we'd hoped. If King's Landing is attacked, you might lose everything when the city burns. Or worse, Cersei might kill Tyrion out of spite before it even happens. Trust me, if you free him, I can ensure your safety. I can speak for you to Daenerys. She might not be happy about your betrayal, but Tyrion could vouch for you if he lives. Bronn clenched his fists. The swirling conflict in his mind turned his stomach to knots. I can't make any promises. If I see a clear chance, maybe. But right now, I'm watched too closely. Jaime nodded, looking disappointed but not surprised. I understand. Just do what you can if you can. I've got to try something. Bronn swallowed hard. Jaime nodded once more, then stepped away, retreating into the darkness of the corridor. For a moment, Bronn stood there, letting the flickering torchlight cast shadows across the walls. He felt the weight of his position more acutely than ever. He had betrayed Tyrion, but now Jaime was asking him to betray Cersei. He was balancing on a razor's edge, and any slip could see him undone. There was no easy path forward. The night passed in a tense fog of worry. At dawn, Bronn manned the city walls near the main gate with a squad of archers and a scorpion crew. A hush fell over King's Landing as the Targaryen forces approached in neat formation, halting just out of bow range. The single dragon circled high overhead, a dark silhouette against the early morning sky. Bronn scanned the horizon, heart pounding. If Daenerys flew in close for a parley, he would have to be ready, though the idea of loosing bolts at a dragon made his skin crawl with memories of the battle on the Rose Road. Cersei herself appeared on the battlements with a retinue of guards, looking imperious in black and gold. The gates groaned open, and she stepped outside onto a cleared area flanked by Lannister archers. Across from her, Daenerys Targaryen rode forward on a white horse, flanked by a handful of Unsullied. She dismounted gracefully, her silver-gold hair braided tight, her face set with calm determination. Bronn observed the tension in every line of her body. Perhaps she knew this was a trap, but she had come anyway, maybe to save Tyrion. Daenerys' voice carried in the still air. Queen Cersei, I have come to parley. I demand the release of Tyrion Lannister." Cersei, her chin held high, merely smirked. "You demand? In my city? You've marched here with your army and a dragon, and you speak of demands." Daenerys's face hardened. "Your brother was my hand. You've held him unlawfully. Return him to me, and we can settle this dispute without further bloodshed." Cersei's laughter rang out. "Dispute? Is that what you call your attempt to steal my throne?" She shook her head. "You come here with half your forces spent, one dragon wounded. I have the advantage, and yet you think to dictate terms." Daenerys's gaze flicked over the walls, probably noting the scorpions and archers. "You mistake me if you believe that. I still have enough men and a dragon." Cersei cut her off. "Which will burn the city and kill thousands of innocent people if you attempt to force your way. I know your nature, Daenerys Targaryen. You claim to break chains, but your father was a tyrant who burned innocents alive. Perhaps you share more with him than you'd like to admit." Daenerys's voice shook with contained anger. "I do not wish to harm the people of King's Landing. That is why I am here, offering a chance for peace." Cersei's smile was cold. "Peace? Release my brother, you say? And in return, what? You'll retreat to Dragonstone? You'll bend the knee to the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms?" Daenerys's posture stiffened. "We both know that won't happen. Tyrion is innocent. If you harm him..." Cersei gestured dismissively. "He's my prisoner accused of treason. He will stand trial when I see fit. If you want him to live, you will lay down your arms and leave." A heavy silence fell. Bronn could see the indecision on Daenerys's face, the moral struggle. She wanted Tyrion back, no doubt, but surrendering her claim on the throne was unthinkable. The dragon circled above, letting out a shriek that echoed across the plain. Cersei raised her hand a fraction. The archers tensed, including those under Bronn's command. Bronn felt sweat bead on his brow, waiting for a signal that might mean an attempted assassination. He knew Daenerys would sense the danger too. In that moment, he wanted to be anywhere else. Daenerys looked around, measuring the risk. Then she spoke again, voice resonant with resolve. "I cannot yield the throne, and you will not return my hand. It seems we are at an impasse." Cersei's lip curled. "So be it. Now that you see the folly of your approach, you may leave. If you linger, I will have no choice but to..." Suddenly, the dragon roared overhead, swooping lower. Bronn instinctively ducked, heart hammering. The archers raised their bows. Cersei's hand lifted further. Bronn saw the subtle movement that might be the signal. Any moment now, she might order them to fire on Daenerys, parley be damned. But then, from the city behind them, a booming gong echoed. Cersei paused, turning her head slightly. Bronn too glanced back. Bells began to ring, not the city's main bells but smaller ones, an alarm of some sort. Screams drifted on the wind, and the watchers on the battlements shouted that some infiltration was happening. For a split second, confusion rippled through the ranks. Daenerys seized that moment. With a swift motion, she mounted her horse and wheeled it around, her unsullied forming a protective ring as they retreated from the city gates. The dragon soared overhead, a formidable shadow, though it did not breathe fire. Cersei cursed under her breath, glaring at the confusion unfolding near the walls. Archers scrambled, uncertain whether to pursue or to deal with the threat behind them. Daenerys's force used the distraction to pull back, out of immediate range. The standoff ended abruptly, with neither side fully engaging. In the midst of the commotion, Bronn could hear the distant clang of steel. Something was happening within the city. He looked to Cersei, who barked orders to the Goldcloaks to secure the gates. Then she rounded on Bronn. "Deal with whatever that disturbance is," she snapped. "If there's an infiltration, I want it crushed immediately." Bronn nodded and motioned to his squad, hurrying back through the gates. As they passed through the city's outer streets, pushing past alarmed citizens who scattered from their path, Bronn saw plumes of black smoke rising near the southern wall. The bells continued to clang, stoking panic among the populace. He tried to piece together what this could be, some covert assault from Daenerys's men, or a faction within the city rising against Cersei. Either way, chaos reigned. He led his men around a corner to see a skirmish underway between a handful of Lannister guards and cloaked figures wielding swords. The cloaked figures fought with surprising skill. One, short in stature, whipped around with a dagger, slashing a guard's throat in a blur of movement. Another dispatched a second guard with a quick thrust. Whoever they were no common rabble. Bronn's men charged, and a brief melee ensued. Amid the clash of steel, Bronn recognized at least one face, Podrick Payne, Tyrion's former squire, now apparently grown into a capable fighter. Another figure had sandy hair and moved with fluid grace, likely Ser Brienne of Tarth. Bronn cursed under his breath. This was a rescue party. They must have somehow snuck into the city. A wave of confusion and conflict washed over him. Should he fight them, as ordered, or try to help them? If they were here for Tyrion, what would that mean for him? Before he could decide, Ser Brienne spotted him. Her blue eyes flashed with anger as she raised her sword. Podrick, near her side, recognized Bronn too. "It's him," Podrick said, voice laced with bitterness. "He betrayed Lord Tyrion." Bronn's men formed a line, swords drawn. Bronn stepped forward, meeting Brienne's gaze. "You're making a big mistake coming here like this." Brienne held her sword aloft, unwavering. "Step aside, Bronn. We need Tyrion, and we'll stop at nothing to retrieve him." Bronn measured her stance. He knew Brienne was a formidable warrior, and Podrick had improved over the years. His own men outnumbered them, but the outcome was far from certain. More Lannister guards would arrive soon, drawn by the commotion. "If I step aside," he said carefully, "I'll lose everything I've worked for. If I don't, well, you'll have to kill me or I'll have to kill you." Brienne's jaw tightened. "I promise to uphold the oath I swore to Catelyn Stark, to protect her daughters, to do what is right. Tyrion Lannister is not an enemy to us. He's fought to save the realm. I won't let him die in Cersei's dungeons." Podrick fixed Bronn with a steely look. "Tyrion was good to me. He taught me things, gave me opportunities when no one else would. How could you do this to him?" Bronn's men shifted anxiously, waiting for his signal. A hush settled over the street, broken only by the distant din of bells. Bronn inhaled. This was the moment. He could defend Cersei's claim, hold on to his new lordship, or he could do something else, something dangerous, uncertain. Jaime's plea lingered in his mind, as did Tyrion's warnings. Perhaps if he let them pass and helped them reach Tyrion, the city might fall, or the realm might shift in ways he couldn't predict. But was that better than continuing under Cersei's yoke? Time stretched. Bronn's hand gripped the hilt of his sword. He glanced at his men, who looked to him for direction. Then, with a quiet resignation, he exhaled. "All right," he said gruffly. "I'm not in the mood to fight you, Brienne of Tarth, or you, Podrick. But my men here can't just stand down. There are guards all over the city. You'll never get Tyrion out of the keep without a fight." Brienne did not lower her sword, but a flicker of hope crossed her face. "If you help us, we might have a chance. Jaime is within the keep. He could help us reach Tyrion." Bronn gave a short, bitter laugh. "Jaime indeed. That fool. Fine. Let's go see if we can save your precious Tyrion, though the gods know it might cost me my head." He turned to his men, who stared at him in shock. "Listen up," he barked. "If any of you want to serve Cersei, go ahead and try to stop us. But if you've any sense, you'll see how the winds are changing. The city could burn by nightfall. Better to be on the winning side, whichever side that might be." The men exchanged nervous glances. One or two scowled, but they saw that their captain was turning cloak. Maybe they valued their own hides more than Cersei's gold. Slowly, they lowered their weapons. "We follow you, Captain," one said, resignation in his voice. Brienne nodded, tension easing from her shoulders. Podrick lowered his dagger. They all stood there for a moment, an alliance born of desperation. Then Bronn said, "We need to move quickly, before more guards arrive." And so they set off through the smoke and chaos, heading for the Red Keep. Bells clamored, the city in uproar. Word had spread that the Targaryen army stood at the gates. Civilians fled in every direction, chaos reigning in the narrow streets. Bronn led the way through back alleys, avoiding major thoroughfares. He knew the keep's side entrances, the hidden sally ports. He had used them to bring Tyrion in. Perhaps they could be used to get him out. Yet as they neared the keep, the number of Lannister guards thickened. A pitched battle might be unavoidable. Bronn's men, uncertain and half-hearted, followed behind while Brienne and Podrick advanced like seasoned warriors. More shapes emerged from the shadows, members of the Northmen or Targaryen loyalists, meeting up in a ragged infiltration force. It seemed Daenerys had planned a two-pronged approach. Distract Cersei at the gate while small teams slipped inside to free Tyrion or sow discord. Now Bronn and Brienne were part of that infiltration, forging ahead. They clashed with a squad of gold cloaks in a courtyard. Swords clanged, sparks flying as steel met steel. Brienne's battle prowess was evident. She dispatched 2 men swiftly. Podrick fought with a new confidence. Bronn found himself cutting down men he had stood alongside just days before. A flicker of regret crossed his mind, but he steeled himself. This was the choice he'd made. If Cersei discovered his betrayal, he'd have no refuge here. The only chance of survival was if Daenerys and Tyrion emerged victorious. At last, they fought their way into the keep's interior. Smoke drifted in from flaming braziers toppled in the commotion. The corridor leading to the dungeons was blocked by rubble, likely an intentional barrier to prevent intruders. Brienne cursed. Podrick searched for another route. Bronn recalled a secondary stairwell, seldom used, that might still be open if the guards hadn't collapsed it. Leading the way, Bronn hacked through a padlocked door, kicking it open to reveal a narrow corridor spiraling downward. Torches flickered weakly, lighting the gloom. They descended at a run, footsteps echoing. The deeper they went, the more the stench of the dungeon assailed them. Shouts reverberated off the walls. They rounded a corner and came face to face with a pair of red-cloaked Lannister knights. Bronn recognized one of them, a seasoned fighter named Ser Ulbert. The knights drew swords, challenging the intruders. Brienne charged, locking blades with one. Podrick maneuvered around the other. Bronn moved to assist, but his own men pressed forward too, overwhelming the knights through numbers. The knights fell and the path lay open. A final iron door barred the way to the lower cells. Bronn's men battered it down with a makeshift ram. The noise reverberated, alerting anyone inside. When they burst through, they found more guards waiting. A full dozen, it seemed. A fierce melee erupted in the torchlit corridor, steel ringing, men shouting in pain. Bronn fought side by side with Brienne, their weapons weaving a deadly dance. Podrick parried a spear thrust, retorting with a slash. One by one, the guards fell, though Bronn's side took losses as well. He saw 2 of his men go down, blood spattering on the dungeon stones. At last, the corridor was clear. They stood before the cell where Tyrion was kept. Bronn looked through the bars. Tyrion was there, huddled in the gloom. He stared back in disbelief. 7 hells, he muttered. I must be dreaming. Podrick reached through the bars. My lord, we've come to free you. Tyrion eyed the battered group, noticing Bronn among them. An unreadable expression crossed his face. Anger, sadness, relief, all jumbled. Bronn, he said softly, I see you couldn't stay away from me for long. Bronn suppressed a grimace. Shut up, Tyrion. We're here to get you out. Stand back. Brienne and Podrick took turns striking the heavy lock with a warhammer they had taken from a fallen guard. Took several hits, sparks flying, until the lock finally shattered. The cell door swung open. Tyrion stood, chains still clamped around his wrists. Brienne rummaged through the guards' bodies until she found a ring of keys. Moments later, the shackles fell from Tyrion's wrists, clattering to the floor. He rubbed his sore arms, grimacing. Thank you, Tyrion said, glancing at Brienne and Podrick. Then his gaze landed on Bronn. And you? Bronn gave a curt nod. We need to move. The city's on the brink of. A thunderous noise shook the dungeon. cutting him off. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the torches flickered violently. Tyrion's eyes widened. "What in the seven hells was that?" Podrick exclaimed. It sounded like an explosion from above. Bronn gritted his teeth. "Daenerys might be attacking the city for real now. We have to get out." Brienne nodded. "Which way?" Bronn tried to recall the labyrinth of tunnels under the keep. "If we head up, we might be blocked by the fighting or debris. There's an old tunnel leading out to the water. It's near the black cells. Risky, but it might be our best shot." Tyrion winced at the mention of the black cells. He had bad memories of them, but nodded his agreement. "Lead on, then." They hurried through the corridor, stepping over bodies. More tremors shook the walls, the reverberations of catapult strikes or dragon fire above. Smoke drifted down the stairwells, and the heat grew intense. Several times they had to detour around collapsed sections of the dungeon. Men coughed as the air filled with ash. The group pressed on, fueled by desperation. Tyrion struggled to keep pace with his shorter stride, but he pushed on, determined. At last, they reached a rusted iron grate set in a wall behind a collapsed arch. Bronn recognized it from older days. He pried at it, but it was stuck. Podrick and Brienne joined him, and together they managed to yank it open. A waft of cooler air brushed their faces. Beyond lay a dim passage slanting downward. Water trickled along the floor, leading to an old storm drain that emptied into the bay. One by one, they slipped into the passage. The sound of collapsing stone echoed behind them, and Bronn knew the keep might not stand much longer if the city was indeed under full attack. They splashed through the shallow water, torches guttering in the stagnant air. The tunnel sloped downward, growing narrower. Finally, they came to a small iron grate leading to the open bay. Through it, they could see the faint light of day, though it was veiled by smoke. Bronn's men forced the grate open. A rush of seawater flooded in, soaking their boots. Tyrion half laughed, half panted. "We're nearly out." Brienne checked the surroundings. "We'll have to swim or find a boat." She glanced at the swirling waters. "It looks rough, but it's that or remain in the dungeons." They waded through the opening, dropping into waist-deep water. Beyond, the churning bay swelled against the cliffs beneath the Red Keep. With a mixture of swimming and clinging to rocks, they maneuvered around a bend. In the distance, they saw a small rowboat moored to a hidden ledge, possibly a smuggler's craft or one left for some covert operation. Bronn thanked the gods for small mercies. They piled into the rowboat, carefully balancing it on the waves. One of Bronn's surviving men, a lanky fellow, took the oars, pulling away from the keep. When they finally looked back at King's Landing, the sight was terrifying. Flames licked at sections of the city, and the sky was dark with smoke. The faint roar of a dragon echoed, and in the distance, they could see it swooping low over the city walls, spouting gouts of flame. Ships in the harbor were in disarray, some aflame, others fleeing. The city was in chaos. Tyrion clung to the side of the rowboat, water dripping from his hair. His eyes were wide with horror and sorrow as he watched his birthplace burn. "The city," Brienne bowed her head. "Daenerys might be exacting vengeance for all that's happened. Or perhaps she's lost control." Podrick shook his head, sadness etched in his face. "So many innocents." Bronn said nothing. He stared at the columns of smoke. He had known that staying in the city under Cersei's rule was dangerous, but he had never fully imagined the scale of destruction if Daenerys unleashed her dragon. Now it was happening. He felt torn between relief at escaping and guilt at the suffering behind them. Tyrion looked at Bronn. Their eyes met, a silent exchange passing between them. Tyrion finally said, his voice subdued, "You may have damned us all by bringing me to her in the first place." Bronn let out a shaky breath. "Maybe, but if I hadn't, she would have just found someone else to do it. She always does." Tyrion nodded, staring bleakly at the city. Perhaps that's true. They turned the boat away from King's Landing, fighting the currents. Refuge lay anywhere but here. For now, they had each other. An unlikely band of survivors, battered by war, linked by tenuous alliances and betrayals. As they vanished into the haze, the city burned behind them, a testament to the brutal games of power that had shaped their destinies. Whether Daenerys would seize the throne or be consumed by her own wrath, none of them could say. But one thing was certain. Bronn's betrayal of Tyrion had set in motion a chain of events from which there was no turning back. He would live with that choice, day after day, in a realm that might never know true peace. Gold and castles were fleeting things. Loyalties were even more fragile. In the swirling tides of Westeros's endless strife, Bronn realized, perhaps too late, that betraying Tyrion had earned him more than a lordship. It had earned him a place in the grand, bloody tapestry of ruin that seemed to envelope all who played the Game of Thrones. And though he had survived, at least for the moment, he could not shake the feeling that the cost of his betrayal was far higher than any price he had ever accepted in gold.